Wouldn't you know? Good evening. I'm Bill Crowley, class of 1969, and tonight I have the honor of performing two very pleasant tasks for you. The first is to welcome you to the first Joseph Murray, MD, class of 1940 Distinguished Lectureship in Medicine, and to provide you with some background on this event, since it hopefully initiates a much larger program that should have an important and lasting impact on the science education here at Holy Cross. The second is to introduce tonight's speaker, Tony Fauci, class of 1962. Those of us who leveraged our superb pre-medical education here at Holy Cross into careers in biomedical research have always deeply appreciated the scientific preparation that was the hallmark of our 4 years here on the Hill. However, due to the lengthy training requirements of careers in medicine, most of us became fundamentally disconnected from our alma mater for nearly a decade following our graduation. While this long training program was a simple fact of our lives for physicians and even longer for MD PhDs, similar training tunnels for our classmates choosing other careers were shorter and less time constrained. The end result was a growing sense of isolation from Holy Cross among graduates choosing careers in biomedical research and practice from their collegiate base. However, Holy Cross's timely investment in science education for the 21st century and the construction of a new science center in 2010 signaled to many of us on the outside a new era was beginning in the history of the institution. Thus, we approached Frank Bellaccio, the senior VP, and Andy Futterman, the pre-medical advisor, with a potential plan to capitalize upon this moment of opportunity to address two very different institutional opportunities simultaneously. The first was to establish a new program that celebrated Holy Cross's wise investment in science by reconnecting the institution with its most accomplished graduates in science. The second was not only to accomplish this goal by establishing an award honoring these individuals, but truly linking this honor with direct contact with the growing and excellent science faculty that we could see was being assembled and their talented students in a very real and potentially ongoing way. After some discussions, we felt establishing a visiting lectureship constituted from the ranks of Holy Cross's most distinguished science graduates was a real opportunity. The notion behind this program was that these individuals would be invited back to give a prestigious lectureship and interact broadly with the science faculty and students over some period of time. The hope was that this program would not only reconnect these excellent science graduates with the Holy Cross community, but potentially ignite an exciting series of scientific interchanges that might endure beyond each single visit. The basic recipe we had in mind was to mix equal parts of young people, new ideas, exciting faculties, new facilities, with the blue skies and open roads that contemporary investment in science increasingly offer to the Holy Cross community and to the world. The expansion of Holy Cross's science program and the opening of a new science center seemed like a natural catalyst for these events. While there was much excitement about this idea, the first two orders of business were then to name the program and identify its first recipient. Both of these were quickly done. As to the name of the program, there was a very short discussion. Clearly, there could be no other name for this program but the Joseph Murray, MD, Class of 1940 Distinguished Lectureship in Medicine. Most schools simply don't have the luxury of having a Nobel laureate after whom to name such a program, but not so Holy Cross. Dr. Murray's legendary accomplishments and achievements of conducting the first renal transplant, establishing a new window of life for hundreds of thousands of patients suffering from renal failure, and essentially founding a new field of biomedical research, organ transplant, was clearly a feat of such enormity that the importance of this could impart no other name to the lectureship but his. So good evening, Joe. Thank you for coming, and thank you for, on behalf of the thousands of patients who's received new lives because of your pioneering work. The naming opportunity of this program, while a large one for your alma mater, is really quite dwarfed by the alleviation of human suffering that your work has engendered. That brought us That brought us to the next issue and my second task. Who should be the founder invitation to the Murray Lectureship? Again, this discussion took about a nanosecond as the answer was equally obvious. The committee viewed selecting the first Murray visiting lectureship for Holy Cross much like choosing a leadoff hitter for the Crusaders science team. First, we needed somebody who could get a hit nearly every time at the plate, or the podium in this case. Since none of us had ever heard Tony Fauci give a bad lecture, that criteria seems secure, and I'm certain you'll agree with me in an hour. Second, the leadoff hitter has to cover a lot of ground quite quickly, being a valid threat to steal the next base, if not the entire show. Perhaps most importantly, the ability to combine all these traits to score is key. In this regard, we were certain that tonight's honoree, Tony Fauci, not only filled the bill, but certainly upheld the Murray tradition of pioneering scientific discoveries, fostering innovation, and providing real medical leadership. His scientific accomplishments are really monumental. These include developing novel treatments for diseases like polyarteritis and Wegener's granulomatosis, diseases that in my time were uniformly fatal till Tony's treatments developed. This accomplishment is still listed among the 20 most important accomplishments in rheumatology in the past 2 decades. However, he's really known for his pioneering efforts in the pathophysiology and developing treatments for the HIV epidemic. He focused immediately on the role of cytokines in paralyzing the body's immune response early on in HIV infections, and he and his team have developed this theme and into therapies that have really changed dramatically the life expectancy of patients. When he first saw patients with full-blown HIV, they had a survival time of 26 days, and they're now 50 years. Thus changing the face of a uniformly lethal disease and the fifth horseman of the apocalypse to a chronic and treatable illness. Tony's authored more than 1,100 peer-reviewed publications across the board in the field of infectious disease, with seminal observations in several areas. His tenure as leading NIH Institute director for 27 years has overseen an impressive legacy of establishing a tone of excellence in science and clinical research. He has passed these scientific discoveries forward via the training and mentorship of dozens of physician scientists in his lab, group, and institute. And he's wisely guided several presidents to not only support his institute and HIV nationally and internationally, but also to sustain broader commitments to biomedical research in general in a quiet background way that's been absolutely crucial for the biomedical research community. A truly remarkable list of honors attests to the uniform esteem that his colleagues hold Tony in. These include the Lasker Award for Public Service, the National Medal of Science and Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Cobra Medal of the American Association of Physicians, the Clinical Research Forum's Award for Innovation and Leadership in Clinical Research, and eventually membership in the National Academy of Sciences, AAAS, and the Institute of Medicine. So, given that these are his accomplishments and the fact that he has been such a tremendous leader for the Holy Cross community and for the entire biomedical research community, it was quite clear that Tony Fauci could be the first of the Joseph Memorial Class of 1940 Distinguished Lectureship. Tony, you're up.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's really a great pleasure and an honor to be here with you this evening, particularly to share the discussion and the honor with a great hero in American and world medicine, Dr. Joseph Murray. And congratulations on all your extraordinary work as well as the inspiration that you've given to me and to so many of my colleagues. It's a real great pleasure to be here to deliver this inaugural lecture. As you can see from this opening slide, the topic that I picked is the area that I'm very heavily engaged in and have been for some time, and it is emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases, the perpetual challenge to global health. And since this is Holy Cross, and since, as you know, I'm a graduate of Holy Cross, I just want to spend a minute or two to tell you how I happened to get involved in this and where I came from. I often get asked when I speak to students, and there was no exception today, where I had a wonderful time interacting with Holy Cross students, is what was it about your background that got you interested in a particular area? And there are several things I think that subliminally do that, but most of the time, if you get good training like the students here get, and you're reasonably smart and attentive, that many of the things that happen to you and fashion what happens in your life are completely out of your control and are really you're the victim of usually, hopefully, good circumstances. So I'll tell you where I came from and how we got to this topic, and I hope you'll find it interesting. So as many good things in life, all good things come from Brooklyn, New York. So that's where I came from, and lived in an ethnic Italian-American neighborhood called Bensonhurst, for those of you who know the history of New York City. My first initiation to the things that I think fashioned my life was obviously my family, as most of us. This is a picture of my father in front of his drugstore in Brooklyn, New York. And people say, well, you went into medicine because your father was a pharmacist. Actually, not at all. I have to clear that up. I decided to go into medicine because I was very interested in people, and I found out as I went into high school that I had an aptitude and a liking for science. And my first introduction to the kind of training that really fashioned my life was actually in high school, which was a Jesuit school in New York City called Regis High School, where I went and was first introduced to the thinking of the humanities and the classics of the Jesuit tradition. And it was in high school that I actually decided that I wanted to go into medicine, because I had a very strong leaning towards the humanities and the classics, and a very, very strong interest in discovery and knowledge, and hence science. And I figured the only way I could actually do both of that would be for me, and that doesn't mean that everybody has to do that route, but for me it was the field of medicine. When I was at Regis, I had my one disappointment in that I loved basketball and wanted actually to be a basketball player. And this is a picture of our varsity team. I'm number 4. It was the days when 5'7" white guards with a two-handed set shot could actually influence a game. That's completely not the case. So I came to Holy Cross after actually playing in New York City basketball against people like George Blaney and Tim Shea and David Slattery and Bob Curran, here my classmate, who was clearly much better than I was in that sport. But I didn't make it as a basketball player. I came to Holy Cross, where I saw a continuation of the same sort of tradition that I was introduced to in Regis High School. And as I mentioned to several of the students today, and the reason I'm giving you this brief story, because it really has to do with some of those subliminal things that sort of goad you towards things that you're wondering why you're really interested in that. And it was really the humanities. I took a course that isn't particularly common here. It was called AB Greek Pre-Med, and it was a course in the humanities where we took far more languages, classics, Latin, Greek, and philosophy than we took science. In fact, we took very, very few science courses, just enough to get you into medical school. But what it did teach me, at least, was to have a real sensitivity to the humanistic aspects of life, not only here in your own immediate environment, but what the historical links and perspectives to that, such as spending time. Now, people ask me, did translating the Iliad and the Odyssey actually help you with anything in medicine? Probably not, but neither did physics or calculus, actually. So it's a draw on that one. In any event, I went to medical school in New York City, and this is a picture of me with the round circle around me, and way in the back row is, you can't see him, is Bob Curran, actually, who was an intern with me. So we went to Cornell together. I did my internship and my residency, and I decided I wanted to go into infectious diseases. And that's where the connection to Holy Cross actually came in, because I was fascinated by the impact of what major pandemics had on society and how it actually forged history in many respects. And listed on this slide are just some of the historically transforming major epidemics, dating back from when we didn't even know what the germ theory was, the plague of Athens. The etiology of that was completely unknown. Everybody's aware of the Black Death, the bubonic plague in the 12th, 13th, 14th century. Smallpox, how it transformed the old and the new world. Cholera, multiple pandemics of cholera, and then the infamous 1918 influenza pandemic that killed 50 million people. So society, for centuries and centuries, was really at the whim of the emergence of pandemics because we couldn't do anything about it. We were extraordinarily vulnerable. But then over the years, over the centuries and the decades, came knowledge, and knowledge of what you can do about it. So I went to the NIH, and as I was mentioning to many of the students today, this is the first example of fate influencing you beyond your control. Why did I go to the NIH? When I was at Cornell, my desire was to practice internal medicine somewhere on 69th Street and First Avenue in New York City. But there was something going on beyond my control, and that was the Vietnam War. And when Bob and I and others were sitting around in our auditorium, we had a Marine recruiter who came in and said to us that at the end of this year, this is our fourth year in medical school, every one of you, except the two women, so you could tell what the age was, two women in my class, the two women over there are going to be in uniform. You're either going to be in the public health service, the Army, the Navy, or the Air Force. So you put your little priority down. I was interested in infectious diseases, so I put the public health service. That would mean either the NIH or the CDC. I put the Navy second, the Army third, and then the Air Force. When I talk to people in the Army, I say I put the Army second, but I really put the Navy second. And anyway, I was fortunate. I got to go to the NIH. I got to go to the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. But there were interesting things that were happening then, because if you look at the impact of infectious diseases, this is the crude infectious diseases mortality rate in the United States from 1900 to 1996. And except for that obvious, egregious blip for the 1918 pandemic, things were getting much, 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 much better in the United States. In fact, what this pattern led some pundits to wax on was that with all of the progress in the control of infectious diseases, and there are many factors that go into that. First of all is understanding the germ theory that microbes actually cause serious diseases. The improvements in sanitation, hygiene, and vector control, and the impact on things like cholera and malaria. The discovery and the development of antimicrobials, which totally transformed the field of medicine. The development of vaccines and advances in detecting and monitoring infectious disease. Because of the success, people were saying, and I'm going to give you one quote, actually, that a scholar at the time, Iden Cockburn, in a treatise that he wrote on the evolution and eradication of infectious diseases, and this was a year after I graduated from Holy Cross and was in medical school, that we can look forward with confidence to a considerable degree of freedom from infectious diseases at a time not too far in the future. Indeed, it seemed reasonable to anticipate that within some measurable time, all major infectious diseases will have disappeared. So here I was getting ready to go down to the NIH and Infectious Diseases Fellowship. I kind of felt like I was going to Miami to be a ski instructor because I was in the wrong field. But what this told me, and it's sad, is at this time, and even the Surgeon General of the United States, William Stewart, said exactly the same thing, that the era of infectious diseases are over. And that bespoke several things: a phenomenal naivete at the historical evolution of microbes, but more importantly, a degree of provincialism in the 60s that is unimaginable, because how could you say the major infections will have disappeared when at that time, of the 59 or so million people a year that died, 25% of them died of infectious diseases. It was the second leading cause of death worldwide, the leading cause of death among young individuals from birth to 49, and the leading cause of what we call DALYs, or disability-adjusted life years, namely years of either death or illness. And yet we were saying the era of infectious diseases, it was a complete lack of sensitivity of what was going on in other parts of the world. And in other parts of the world, what you have was diseases that were killing millions of people, particularly in the developing world. So having said that, when I look at infectious diseases, and I'm going to break the talk down into a couple of subcategories, you got to look at them in two ways: established infectious diseases and what we call emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases, and I'll explain what I mean in a moment. Established infectious diseases are the ones that we know about and can almost predict how many people they're going to kill each year. And here's a list of selected established infectious diseases of global health importance. Something that is off the radar screen: respiratory infections, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Pneumonia kills about 1.6 million children a year. They're preventable by vaccination and curable by antibiotics, and yet 1.6 million people die. HIV/AIDS on this slide is an established disease. In a few minutes, I'm going to talk to you about 29 years ago, it was an emerging disease. But when a disease hangs around for more than a quarter of a century, you can essentially say it's established. Diarrheal diseases, tuberculosis, vaccine-preventable diseases, malaria, neglected tropical diseases. You can predict, as I'm going to show you in a moment, that these diseases are going to wreak havoc throughout the world. That's what global disease and global health is all about. But this is the point that I was making a few minutes ago. If you look at the proportion of deaths due to infectious diseases, around 6% of the deaths in high-income countries are due to infectious diseases. Almost 65% of the deaths in the developing world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, are due to infectious diseases. Now remember, most infectious diseases are either preventable and or treatable, and yet more than 60% of people in sub-Saharan Africa die. That's what global health is about, and that's what we had been missing until just recently, when all of a sudden we'd become a globally connected world. So it goes well beyond just medicine. It goes to why the world is connected to each other and why global health is so important. The other side of the coin is emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. So let me tell you what I mean by that. Between 1940 and 2004, there have been about 300 plus emerging diseases. Now, some of them are trivial in that they're curiosities. You read about it in the paper, it kills a few people in a faraway land, and nobody worries about it. But then every once in a while, you get a real whopper of an emerging disease that has a major impact on society. So this is a map of the world that I show to the Congress every single year. I started it 25 years ago when I made my first testifying before the Congress about HIV/AIDS, and I show it to them every single year. And the reason they don't get bored with it is that every year I add 1, 2, and sometimes 3 diseases. Now, I certainly don't have the time, and I wouldn't bore you with talking about everything on this slide, but let me just give you an example in a fast-forward way of how things have built up. So you have HIV, which is the mother of all truly emerging disease, because it's a brand new disease that the human species had not encountered before it was recognized in 1981. Then you have a disease like West Nile virus, which I'm going to talk to you about in a minute, or SARS. SARS was really interesting. It knocked out the economy of Canada and of Hong Kong and part of China for a year, and then it just disappeared spontaneously. The anthrax bioterrorism, which I had to get involved in at the time when we were not sure where that came from. Multiple drug-resistant microbes, from Staph aureus, MRSA, methicillin-resistant staph, drug-resistant malaria, MDR and XDR TB, influenza pandemics that never happened, that we were preparing for, influenza epidemics that happened that we weren't prepared for. That's all part of the big package of emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. So what are the things that contribute to that? Why is it that microbes continue to emerge and re-emerge? I have 7 bullets here on this. I'll really quickly go through them, but the underlying theme of all of them is the human species perturbing, or said a little bit more crudely, messing with its environment and its ecology. Human demographics and behavior, technology and industry encroachment on natural venues, economic development and land use, international travel. Decades ago, if a disease started in Asia or in Africa, it may take months to get here. The farthest of the disease away, you can go halfway around the world in 18 hours. So there isn't anything that's more than 18 hours away by airplane. Breakdown of public health measures, exactly what happened and is happening as we speak in Haiti right now with the reemergence of cholera. The ecological, environmental, but the one that really is the most interesting from a scientific standpoint is the microbial adaptation and change, namely the ability of microbes by their inherent ability to replicate extraordinarily rapidly and to mutate, that any pressure, be it immunological, antimicrobial, or environmental, that perturbs them, the microbe will naturally seek to survive. The same way the human species, if you put pressure on it, would naturally seek to survive. And that really is what happened. I'll give you an example of why, if we try to keep up with the microbe's ability to evade what we do, we would always lose, because evolutionarily, they really have us beat. And let me give you an example of that. The human species, from the time of a chimpanzee to a human as we know it now, about 8 million years of evolution, there's been a 2% change in the genome. A typical human virus, in one day, will change 2% of its genome, merely by mutation. So if we're going to try and evolve ourselves, we've lost that game really fast. So the only thing we need to do is to use our smarts and the thing that actually makes us human, an intellect, a will, and a desire to address public health issues. So, having said that, let's take a look at the thing that people ask me, what keeps you up at night? I don't even want to tell you what keeps me up at night. But one of the things that keeps me up at night, because I worry about everything, it's one of those things, is emerging diseases. So let's break down emerging diseases into newly emerging and re-emerging or resurging. Let's take newly emerging diseases. My entire professional and, in fact, personal life was dramatically changed one day, and this is example number 3, of things completely beyond my control. I was a very successful physician doing work on rheumatological diseases and the interface of the regulation of the immune system for about 8 or 9 years at the NIH. One day I was sitting in my office, and this landed on my desk in June of 1981, and I was clinically trained in infectious diseases, but my basic research training was in immunology, and I was studying the interface between microbes and the immune system. And this MMWR, which is Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report from the CDC, lands on my desk in Bethesda. I was in my office from June 5th, 1981. Pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, which is a disease that you only see in immunosuppressed individuals, in 5 gay men in Los Angeles. And I remember being struck by that because they were otherwise healthy gay men. And I had seen a lot of pneumocystis. Most physicians at the time didn't even know what pneumocystis is because as an infectious disease person, I was the infectious disease consult for the National Cancer Institute, which were treating people with lymphomas and Hodgkin's and leukemias, and they were getting pneumocystis. So I knew right away that something is funny here. Why are these guys immunosuppressed? I didn't make much of it. I thought maybe they had some drug that had suppressed their immune system. And then 1 month later, on the 4th of July, came out another MMWR of 26 gay men, otherwise well, not only from LA, but San Francisco and New York, who had not only pneumocystis pneumonia, but Kaposi sarcoma, which also is seen essentially only in immunosuppressed people. That was the first time that in my medical career that I actually got goosebumps thinking, because I knew then for sure that we were dealing with a new disease. This was not an accident. And it was at that point that I did something that I can't even fully explain now. I completely changed the direction of my career, put aside everything else what I was doing, recruited a couple of young people out of their internship, and started the AIDS program at the National Institutes of Health. Fast forward a quarter of a century. When I made that change, my very helpful and brilliant mentors at the NIH were looking at me with a degree of skepticism, like, why are you throwing away a promising career by studying a disease that likely will go away and is confined to a relatively disenfranchised population? And being an infectious disease person, it was clear to me that it was a sexually transmitted disease. There was no doubt about that. And it was an infection. So I figured something really simple, that if there's one universal thing in the world is sexuality and sex, so it's not going to stay confined to one particular group. In fact, I wrote an article that people criticized me about in 1981 in the Annals of Internal Medicine, saying that anybody thinks that this is going to stay confined to an epidemiologically restricted group is making a decision that's completely unfounded on science. And people say, well, who does he think he is talking like that? And it turned out, unfortunately, to be the truth. I hated to be prescient then. So now we have 65 million people that were ultimately infected, 20+ million died, 33 million living with HIV, 2.7 million new infections, and 2 million deaths. So historically, going back to that second slide that I showed you, and my fascination with the history of the evolution of pandemics, I found myself back in ancient history class, back in thinking about the old days, and it was sort of everything came together, and that's what I've actually been doing for the last 28 years. So let's take a look at this. The NIH became interested in this early on, obviously. The country did not. I think from the standpoint, and I'm not going to go into that tonight, the interactions that I've had personally with every president from Reagan and up into the currently with President Obama, that we were slow off the blocks. I became director of the Institute in 1984, and that was one of the reasons that I wanted to become director, was to really enhance what we're doing in global health. And the budget of the NIH with AIDS now is extraordinary. We spent a total of over $45 billion cumulatively on HIV, and about 10 or 11% of the NIH budget. The NIH budget is about $32 billion, and we spend about $3.1 billion on HIV. That was the investment. The thing that AIDS actually did is really provide an extraordinarily cogent example of the relationship between investment in science and a public health result that you can really get your arms around. Because the advances in AIDS research since 1981 have been nothing short of breathtaking, particularly in the arena of treatment, the development of drugs that have transformed the lives of HIV-infected individuals. We now have 30 FDA-approved drugs that, when used in combination, have completely transformed the lives of HIV-infected individuals. I want to tell you a factoid that's the truth. We have more antivirals for HIV than the sum total of all antiviral drugs of all other viral diseases combined. Now, that's not an accident. It had to do with an investment in biomedical research, but it also had to do with pharmaceutical company interest in making drugs that they know tens of millions of people are going to have to take for the rest of their lives. And I don't mean that as an indictment of the pharmaceutical company. I think that's the thing that stimulates them to do that. And the reason I'm going to show you that is because in a minute or so I'm going to get to, if we can do this with HIV, then why can't we do it with a lot of the other diseases that were on one of my prior slides? So let me tell you what these drugs have done. This is a picture of me on rounds at the NIH in the early 1980s, talking to a bunch of our students and residents. This is one of the very early patients, and as Bill had mentioned, when a patient would walk into my clinic back then, they usually had very advanced disease, because it wasn't like now you get a test and you find out you're HIV positive and you may feel perfectly well, because the median time till you get clinically relevant disease is about 10 years as a medium. Some people get sick right away. Some people are long-term survivors and long-term non-progressors. But if you walked into my clinic at NIH in the 1980s, the median was about 26 weeks before you died. It was a very depressing part of my medical career, because previously I had developed these treatments that were curative of a bunch of inflammatory diseases, and I felt very good. Most of the patients would come in, get better, and say, "Oh my God, you saved my life." I went through multiple years of everybody dying. With the new drugs that we have now, if the same person comes into my clinic and is 20 years old and is newly infected with HIV, you could mathematically model that they would live at least an additional 50 years. So that happens to be one of the most impressive advances in investing in a disease that you didn't even know what it was until 1983-84, to now having this extension of life expectancy. So now another little twist, that my interest in people and how people felt about it, about things like disease and health. I had a substantial interaction with activist group in the United States, particularly the very articulate gay activists in New York and San Francisco and LA, who appropriately were demanding access to drugs when they were in clinical trials before they were even proven to be effective. And I got very heavily involved with them and did some things that could have gotten me into trouble but didn't, which has me always prove that in Washington, when you're doing something right, it is always better to ask for forgiveness than permission, because you'll never get permission to do anything. So you just did it. And what we did is that we came out very publicly to have drugs available for people outside of the clinical trials. The reason I tell you that little story is that many years later, in the year 2000, the Southern Africans borrowed a page from the playbook of the USA activists and said, now you have all of these people in the developed world, in Canada, Australia, Europe, and the United States, who are essentially leading normal lives, and we, in the developing world, have most of the cases of HIV. Another factoid, 92% of all HIV infections are in the developing world. 67% of them are in Southern Africa. South Africa, in a per capita basis has the most. So the South Africans were saying, we really want to get access to drugs. And then the next thing, number 4, which was completely out of my control, was that, and this goes back many years when I didn't get, President Reagan was very courteous with me, but he didn't really put much public bully pulpit emphasis on HIV. But the subsequent president, George H.W. Bush, was a man of great sensitivity to the suffering of others. And when he was vice president, he wanted to learn about HIV. He came to the NIH and he said, who's this guy Fauci that I hear is doing stuff on HIV? I'd like to spend a day with him. And he spent the day with me, and we became very good friends, and I was able to interact with him, get the budget up, and the same thing went on to President Clinton, who was also very sensitive to all this. But during the George H.W. Bush tenure as president, I got to meet his son, who was a staffer actually in the White House, as well as a very young staffer named Josh Bolton, who turned out to be the chief of staff of George W. Bush, which is another rule in Washington: be nice to everybody, because you never know where they're going to wind up. I learned that really, really early. To make a long story short, because of this interest in doing something for the Africans, this is a picture of somebody maybe most people don't know, is Tommy Thompson, who was the Secretary of HHS under President George W. Bush. So since I knew the president from the time that he was a staffer in the White House, he asked me to go to Africa with Tommy and to figure out, is it feasible to actually treat people in the developing world where there is hardly any healthcare infrastructure, and would it be worth an investment on the part of the American people? And you might be, well, yeah, it wasn't that long ago, so some of you may have remembered that there were people that said, oh, you can't treat Africans with drugs that you have to give every day. They don't even know how to tell time. They won't know when to take the drugs, and which was, you know, if not consciously, certainly more than subliminally racist about how they would think about that. So anyway, the president sent Tommy Thompson and I to Africa. We visited these countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and we came back and met with them many times, and this was me with a 17-year-old girl who was actually delivering medicines in the bush in Uganda. This is in a place called Tarara, which is in the northern part of Uganda, about 4 hours from Kampala. I spent a couple of days with her, and she proved to me, and this is her on a bicycle, her motorcycle. I was in a Jeep. She wanted me to ride on the back of the bicycle, but I figured, gee, a bicycle crash in Uganda? No, that's not what I want to do. So anyway, I stayed with her. We went to villages, delivered drugs to this, for example, this village. 4 out of the children in this picture were HIV infected. So I came back and I told the president that I thought that this was something that would be feasible, that we could do. So he said, okay, I want you to think about it, go back to Africa and come back with a plan to transform. I want a game changer. And he said, give me 3 versions, the Chevrolet version, the Oldsmobile version, and the Mercedes version, about how we can treat the most people with, and I said, well, what's the price tag? He said, don't worry about the price tag, just go down. And I did. And I spent the next 8 months trying to do mathematical modeling. Make a long story short, we came out with a program which he actually asked me, what do you think we should call it? I said, well, you thought of it, so why don't we call it the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief? And that's how PEPFAR came about, which started off as a $15 billion program over 5 years, which has prevented 7 million infections, treated now 2.4 million people, and cared for 10 million people who were HIV infected, and even orphan children. 2.5 million people in countries with the highest HIV burden were saved. And when you combine that with the Global Fund and the Gates Foundation and the Clinton Foundation, there has really been a transformation now of how we look at what's possible in the developing world. I got to meet some very interesting characters during that period of time that I'll just share with you because it's kind of funny. This is a picture of Bono, in case you don't recognize him, to show you what a complete nerd I was at the time. I was in my office and Bono's manager called up and said, we're hearing rumors that you're working with the White House on a big program, and nobody knows what it is. Bono wants to see if he can influence the European countries, so would you like to meet him? And my first question, I didn't say it over the phone, was like, who's Bono? Sorry, I was working really hard. I didn't have time. Anyway, I said, sure, fine, I'd be happy to talk to you. He was in Chicago. He said, I really need to talk to you tonight. We're in Chicago. Can we fly in? They had their own plane. Could we fly in and see you in Washington tonight and discuss, so we could do a strategy that would be synergistic? And I said, sure, fine. Why don't I give you my address and you could just come over to the house. It was in October. We're sitting in the back porch, and I actually cooked some rigatoni with sausage for him as he came in. The one thing I didn't do is that I didn't tell my kids, and I had 3 teenage girls at the time, that, because I didn't know this was important. So we're sitting in the house, and all of a sudden around 8:30, 8:45, the doorbell rings, and I told my daughter Jennifer, who was a sophomore in high school at the time, I said, why don't you go answer the door? She opened the door, and I heard this shrieking scream, Daddy, Bono's at the door. I said, oh my God. She never forgave me for that because she was so embarrassed. In any event, we put together a plan, and he has been, some of the rock stars that do these things are in it just for the publicity. This person is really for real and has done an awful lot. So if you put the 3 together, the President's Emergency Plan, the Global Fund, and the philanthropic organizations, we now have 5.2 million people who are on antiviral drugs and whose lives essentially have been saved, which is extraordinary impact. That's the history behind that. But it begged the question for me, if you could do it with HIV, why can't you really do it for other diseases? So then you start looking at other things in Africa. You can't just go in and fix something in a developing country, because although we were saving 5 million lives, only 30 to 40% of the people who needed therapy were getting it, which means 60 to 70% weren't. And for every 1 person we put on therapy, 2 to 3 people got newly infected. So if you do the math, you were losing the game. It's like, you shoot and somebody scores 2 baskets for everyone. You may look good scoring shots, but you're losing the game. And we were actually losing the game. So the answer was prevention. So we began research on a number of prevention modalities that have been proven, everything from blood screening to condom distribution, treatment for mother-to-child transmission, adult male circumcision, needle exchange, all the things that worked. That was the good news. The sobering news that less than 20% of the people who would benefit from these treatment modalities were actually having access to them, which started to really impress upon me that you can't just be giving medicines in the developing world. And when you think about global health, you have to partner with the countries to develop sustainable infrastructure. These are some of the selective HIV prevention strategies that are under development. Stay heads up, you're going to be hearing a lot about these things over the next couple of years, and I don't have time to go into each and every individual one. So that was AIDS, and that was a brand new disease that had profound global health impact. Then you get the curiosities. Some of you may remember SARS. Big splash in the newspapers and in the media. It started off as an atypical pulmonary infection in China. The Chinese knew it was an influenza, but unfortunately at the time they weren't particularly transparent to tell the rest of the world until one of the physicians from Guangdong province went to Hong Kong and stayed at the Metropole Hotel, and in one few-day period infected about 19 people who then went to different parts of the world, including Canada and different parts in Europe, and we had an explosion of cases, 8,000 cases, about 800 deaths. But lucky for us, it just disappeared. It jumped from an animal species, and by the way, 75% of new and emerging infections jump from animals to humans. You just named them. Influenza is a bird disease. HIV came from non-human primates, et cetera, et cetera. So that was an important newly emerging disease. Then you have re-emerging or resurging diseases. And what do we mean by that? So take tuberculosis, an ancient disease. So here's where a realization of dropping back and go to 40,000 feet. Nobody really cared about about tuberculosis in the United States, because except for very, very poor populations and homeless people, it isn't a big problem. In fact, the incidence of tuberculosis was plummeting until HIV came along and there was a little blip. However, there are 1.8 million deaths per year with tuberculosis, and it's reemerged in a multiple and extensively drug-resistant form. So another example of our provincialism is that we went to Africa to do HIV because HIV started, we thought, it didn't, in the United States. We became very interested, and then we started to see things that we knew, but they never registered in us, that you're talking about diseases that are killing almost 2 million people. The same thing with the burden of malaria. We just really, not that we didn't care about malaria, but malaria was killing about 1 million people a year, mostly African babies, less than 5 years old, and every 30 seconds, a child, almost always an African child, dies from malaria. So we started doing things about malaria. Then there's the re-emerging disease that occurs in a different location. West Nile virus existed for centuries in Africa and in the Middle East. In 1999, a plane landed at Kennedy Airport in Long Island, and something got off. It was either a person who was infected, it was a bird that was a carrier, or it was a mosquito that was in the hold of the plane. We had a few cases in New York, and I remember CNN asking me, do you think that this is going to spread throughout the United States? And, you know, in biology, as you all know, you never say never and you never say always. But I did. I said, absolutely. How can you be so sure? And the reason is we have the right mosquitoes. We have people who are no different than people in the Middle East or in Africa. And we have a lot of birds. And what happened is that just what happened, is that West Nile virus became endemic. It's not something that people get very concerned about because the incidence of it is very low. But it went from no cases for centuries and millennia in the New World to now established in the United States. Dengue, another example. The red across the map is the dengue belt. Dengue causes about 2.5 million infections, including 500,000 hospitalizations. It's a very serious disease that's mosquito-borne. As infections are unpredictable, but there are things about them that are quite predictable. So if you look at the left-hand side, you see that in the New World, it is in the Caribbean. This is, the red circles are the number of countries since 1955 in which there's dengue, and the blue bars are the number of cases. So dengue is clearly increasing. So 2 years ago, I wrote a commentary in the Journal of the American Medical Association saying dengue and hemorrhagic fever is a potential threat to public health in the United States, and we should really be careful about it. A lot of people got concerned that I was being alarmist about this. Well, then the next year, there were 28 cases of dengue in Florida, not only in the Keys, but also in Dade County. So that's another thing that we have to pay attention to, almost like the microbes are kind of lapping at the shore. It's not something that you need to panic about, but it just tells you something about the extraordinary ability of these microbes to evolve. And then, as we speak today, another example of poverty follows disease and disease follows poverty, and the sanitary conditions that in Haiti, which has really gotten beat up with earthquakes and floods, is now in the midst of a cholera outbreak that hadn't been seen in Haiti for more than 6 decades. So another example of emerging disease. I want to close by just a couple of minutes on influenza, because this is the truth. When people do ask me, what does keep you up at night? It's really the emergence of a respiratory-borne illness that is highly pathogenic. And influenza is really interesting because influenza can be categorized in 2 of the baskets that I had before you tonight. It's a re-emerging disease because every season it changes just a little bit enough that you require a vaccination for a really good complete immunity, but it doesn't change so much that it poses a public health threat like a pandemic. Whereas pandemic influenzas are truly a brand new virus. So I tend to look at it as that if this is influenza, each year it drifts by changing some of the antigens on its surface. It's highly predictable. It's like clockwork. Every winter in the northern hemisphere, your winter, if you're in Australia or in South America, it's in their summer, their winter, our summer, you get predictable occurrence, residual immunity. We've never taken seasonal influenza seriously, yet it kills about 500,000 people a year globally, and in the United States, an average of about 36,000 deaths. And unfortunately, the reason people don't get excited about it is because of those 36,000 deaths, about 92% of them are in people older than 65, and about 80% of them are in people who are really 80 years of age or older. So it isn't looked upon with the kind of fear, sort of like people have a lot of other different diseases, which I think is really quite insensitive. Because when we talk about elderly, the definition of elderly is anybody that's older than I am. But when it starts hitting kids, then people start getting concerned. So then you get to pandemic influenza, and everybody's afraid of a repeat of the pandemic of 1918, 1919, where 50 million people died, and it was distributed very evenly. A lot of kids, a lot of young people. So that was really a big catastrophe. We have had the first pandemic of the 21st century. Unfortunately, it turned out to be a relatively mild pandemic, but people got very excited about it. And this is interesting statistics that doesn't get much publicity. 61 million cases in the United States, 275 hospitalizations. There were only 12,000 deaths. Well, when you're talking about deaths, you should never say only, but for the purposes of the emphasis, but there were 1,280 pediatric deaths. So although the disease burden was less than even a seasonal flu, more children died from this than in any other seasonal flu year. So if you're a child or a pregnant woman, then you really had a problem. So what's the solution to that? The solution is to not be chasing your tail all the time, trying to make a new vaccine each season, but to actually treat seasonal influenza and pandemic influenza the same. Get everybody vaccinated every year, and that's the new CDC recommendation. Anybody over 6 months should get vaccinated with flu every year. So I close with that, but also to just show you how global health has really emerged greatly on the radar screen of people. Particularly among young people. I know from my talking to people here at Holy Cross, and all of my 3 daughters have in one time or another traveled to the developing world more than once to volunteer in things that had to do with global health, from Africa to South America to the Caribbean. President Obama has now really codified this by putting forth his comprehensive global health strategy, and in a speech in Ghana a year ago last summer, to his credit, recognized the work that President Bush had done, and actually a quote from him saying that building on the strong efforts of President Bush with HIV and malaria will carry forward the fight against AIDS and pursue the goal of ending deaths from malaria and tuberculosis. And in fact, these are the target areas of President Obama's global health initiative, and if you look carefully, there's a lot of other things in global health besides infections. But infections dominate this because these are 4 of the things that we've actually been discussing. So the one message that I want to leave you with is that there are trends in the interests of people. We currently have an intense interest in global health, but global health will only work if we approach it in a way to build sustainable systems in the developing world. To practice what we used to call parachute science, you parachute in, you take care of a disease, and you go out. That's not going to work. You've got to go and partner, and actually Secretary Clinton has really been a champion of that, of turning development into a partnership of building sustainability of health systems in the developing world, and only then are you going to really have your handle on global health. And as I commented in an article I wrote in Nature Medicine 3 years ago, when we were just starting to get really excited about global health, I said it was imperative that we use the current momentum, and the momentum that I'm talking to you about tonight, recognizing that the enormous challenges of global health are going to require a long-term commitment that is sustained even when global health and those fighting to improve it are no longer in the headlines. So when Bono goes away, which he will someday, when Brad Pitt and Angelina go away, which they will someday, we're still going to have a problem that we really need to face. And the only way to face that is a very long-term commitment. Thank you. Thank you. So we have time for questions, I'm told. So I'd be happy to entertain questions that you might have, if you have any.
Hey, Tony. Joe Dorsey. One of the things that we learned as we came through Holy Cross was the importance of viewing science through a prism of ethics and morality. I think the church is faced with a great difficulty in trying to strike the right balance of values and priorities, and it's extremely difficult for me to defend the fact that we condemn the use of condoms as a method morally acceptable for the prevention of HIV. My second comment is that I would hope that next year's speaker would be Paul Farmer.
I agree with you on that. That Paul would come. I'm sure he would if you ask him. But the whole issue of condoms. I mean, condoms is a very effective way to prevent HIV infection, and which is the reason why I'm bullish on recommendation of the distribution of condoms, and I have been from the very beginning. Yes. Yes. Yes, cutaneous leishmaniasis.
What are the chances of wiping that out?
The chance of, first of all, it's treatable with antibiotics, number one. The question was, what about what people have gotten in Iraq and in Afghanistan, which is cutaneous leishmaniasis. There's work on a vaccine for that. The idea of wiping it out completely is unlikely, particularly in countries in which it is endemic, like in Afghanistan. Before we start working on leishmaniasis, I'd like to get maternal-child health taken care of first in Afghanistan. The chances of a mother dying in childbirth in Afghanistan is extraordinarily high. So it's the priority of things. I mean, leishmaniasis is terrible, but there are a lot of other more important things that are going on there. Yeah.
Hi. My name is Rita Sanderson. I'm a parent of a med student who's currently in Indianapolis, and I'm also clerk for the Massachusetts CFITS Association, and I have a few brief questions about a retrovirus.
Could you talk into the microphone, because I can't...
I guess that would help.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
I have a few questions about retrovirus that there was a study that was recently published, and the authors were from the NIH and FDA. It's a murine leukemia virus in the CFS affected patients. I'd like to hear your comments on that. It was found in what was considered significantly high percentage. Do you consider that retrovirus or that family, I believe it's the gamma retroviral family, is that really a health threat? And in the Wall Street Journal, I see that you may be involved with a multi-center study center for that particular illness, but also to expand that study, all more or less having to do with XMRV or MLV virus. So if you could comment on any of those.
Sure. Well,
Thank
very
you.
quickly for the audience who may not know the scenario of this question, there was some time ago the identification, reported identification of a retrovirus, which was a xenotropic mouse retrovirus, in individuals with either prostate cancer or, more importantly, with chronic fatigue syndrome. And then there were about 10 studies that couldn't find that. And then about a month and a half ago, there was a study from the CDC that couldn't find the association, and a similar study from the FDA, NIH, which found an association. Whenever you see something like that, you always have to be concerned that you're dealing with a contaminant or an artifact. And I don't know what the answer is, but what you read in the Wall Street Journal of what I'm doing is that I'm sponsoring a study to try and see if it is in fact a contaminant or an artifact by getting the groups that did the study with completely conflicting results and getting samples from normal people who are not ill and samples from people with documented chronic fatigue syndrome, and giving it to the different laboratories blinded so that they don't know what samples they're getting, and see if they come up with the right results. And then that's, I think, the easiest scientific way to handle that, because it's still unclear what the right answer is. Yeah.
Dr. Fauci, thank you for being here and making this a memorable evening. It's really terrific to hear you and compliment you on all of your work. As the reigning Commissioner of Public Health for the City of Worcester, I'd like to say that there are two issues that I think are not necessarily infectious diseases, but relate to the number of people who survive and the number of people who die in our society. One of them is the increasing violence in our society. Clearly, 55 people have died in Boston already this year from murder. And more importantly, there are 2.7 people dying a day in Massachusetts from drug overdose. This, to me, is really the plague of the 21st century.
Right. Thank you for that comment. I agree with you completely. There are many other problems besides the ones we've spoken about tonight that inflict society. Yeah.
My name's Gary Wolf. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Could you comment about the amount of immunology that you learned in medical school and the state of the art then and what it is now, and the importance of lifelong learning?
That's easy. The amount of immunology that I learned in medical school was essentially zero. There wasn't immunology. It was a new discipline, which was one of the things that excited me about going to the NIH and starting to study human immunology, when most of the immunology was in mouse immunology and guinea pig immunology. Right now, immunology has exploded over the last several decades as one of the most exciting fields, in the whole area of immune tolerance that, relate to things like transplantation, exciting, unimaginable years ago. So lifelong learning. Yeah, I had a lot to learn because I didn't know anything. It was easy. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Fauci. Thank you so much for your comments. It's been great to have you back at Holy Cross. I just had a question. I've read a lot of criticism about the effectiveness of PEPFAR and whether or not it's made more ineffective by the regulations placed on it by the U.S. government. I don't know if you had any comments on that.
Yeah, well, the answer is, what you asked a cryptic question, which I'll clarify for the audience. The regulations are not really regulations. What it was is that the original PEPFAR was that of the 20% of the money that went for prevention, 1/3 of it had to be spent on abstinence only. That was one of the controversial things. The other one was that since commercial sex workers are an important target of your prevention therapies, it was kind of tough because some of the implementers of the prevention program demanded that you publicly state your opposition to commercial sex work. And it's tough to do that in a clinic that is seeing commercial sex workers. So those restraints have been gradually lifted. The abstinence thing was really something that was demanded of, based on what was going on in Uganda, where they had the ABCs, abstinence, be faithful, use condoms. I never liked that, and there was, to tell you an inside baseball, that's really inside baseball, there was a big argument among some groups, and mostly, quite frankly, people in Christian charities and Christian conservative groups that didn't want PEPFAR to spend any money on condoms. And I insisted with the president that if we didn't include condoms in it, we might as well forget about a prevention program. So we had a compromise that we, in order to get it through the Congress, which is one of the beautiful and frustrating things about Washington, sometimes you have to compromise. So we said, okay, we'll do condoms, but you can have a program that preaches just abstinence. Personally, I think that abstinence alone in a vacuum doesn't work at all. I mean, you could delay sexual debut by a year maybe, but to train someone about, and you can't train somebody for abstinence, to try and preach abstinence without teaching people how to use condoms is sort of like saying that you don't want to talk about condoms because teenage pregnancies are going to go away. They're not going to go away. So it's not a problem now. Now it's all of those constraints are gone.
Hi,
Yeah.
thank you very much for coming to Worcester. I'm Stanley Levinson, a local dentist, and I wonder if you can comment on something that is of a concern to me, which is human papillomavirus. What's going on?
Yeah. So what aspect of human papillomavirus?
Well, I don't know if, especially with a lot of young people in the audience, if people are really educated about it. And,
Yeah.
I think
Well,
it's-
you know, human papillomavirus is the unequivocal cause of cervical cancer, and as you know, there's vaccinations for HPV recommended for women, young women of certain age, expanding the scope of them. It is also associated with oropharyngeal cancers, which is important. It's a sexually transmitted disease, and there's even consideration now about vaccinating men with it so that they don't transmit it to women. So it's a very important infectious disease cause of cancer. There are a few infectious diseases that are directly related to cancer: hepatitis B, hepatitis C, EBV, and HPV, among others. So it is an important problem. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if you could comment on what you believe is the greatest threat facing the nation in regards to bioterrorism, and how prepared is our government to deal with it?
Yes, there is a threat of bioterrorism. There's no doubt that there have been good intelligence about radical terrorist groups trying to get a hold of microbes, and the easiest one would be anthrax, and to just spread anthrax. So when you say how well prepared we are, there's preparation that has nothing to do with medicine, and there's preparations that are directly related to medicine. We invested several billions of dollars over the last few years since the anthrax attack following 9/11 to increase our stores of smallpox vaccine, because we know that you could aerosolize smallpox, to develop a good anthrax vaccine and supply our strategic national stockpile with ciprofloxacin and doxycycline and other antibiotics, and to develop vaccines against other of the threats. We are not as prepared as you can be, because you could never prepare for something that some crazy person is going to want to do. What you can be prepared to is how you're going to respond. So I would think that we're reasonably well prepared to respond to an event. I really can't comment, because that's not my area of expertise, about how well prepared we are from an intelligence standpoint to stop something before it starts. But if somebody wants to make mischief, they can. I worry much more about other threats of terrorism than bioterrorism, even though I'm a a person who's involved in defense against bioterrorism. It's much easier to throw up a bomb in Times Square than it is to spread tularemia, to be honest with you. Yeah, one final question. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fauci. My name is Donathe Musu. I was so excited to hear you comment about, the HIV situation in Uganda. That is my country of origin. My request is for you to comment about the HIV discordancy phenomenon. Thank you.
As far as what?
HIV discordancy, where one partner where one partner.
I'm sorry. It's age, my ears. Yeah, the question is about discordancy, HIV discordant couples. One couple is HIV infected and the other one is not. That is the perfect setting for what's called pre-exposure prophylaxis. We funded a study in Southern Africa in which we gave preemptively the treatment of individuals who were in a discordant couple, and there was a 92% decrease in transmission from one to the other. So it really does work. HIV, the fact is that if you don't have another sexually transmitted disease, HIV in reality, by mucosal transmission, vaginal transmission, or vaginal penile transmission, is a very inefficient infection to transmit. I hesitate to say that ever publicly because then people get the message, well, if it's inefficient, then I can be careless and not worry about it. And it's not something you want to get. But if you have a regular sexual partner who's HIV infected, then the odds of your getting infected are reasonably good over a period of time. And that's what the gentleman was referring to as a discordant couple. But you could really block that just by treating. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thanks.